Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome into the show. August 2nd. Here we go. We are full on fantasy football mode. The season is coming. We're just a little bit more than a month away, so I'm super excited. Look, I have compiled a list here of mistakes that I see people making, and I just cringe when I see it. When people do these things in drafts or throughout the season, it just makes me sick. So I want to make sure that you guys, the people that follow my channel, the people that watch my videos, do not make these mistakes. So I'm going to walk you through these and make sure that you don't do these things because they're going to cause you to be losing players at fantasy football if you do these things. So I want to make sure that you avoid these mistakes. So I'm going to start with the very first thing on my list, and that's one of the most important things that I have on here, and that's being afraid to draft rookies. Now, you see this all the time in fantasy. People are afraid to draft rookies because they haven't taken an NFL snap. You're already hearing it with Bijan. Oh, I'm not going to draft a player in the first round who hasn't played an NFL snap. Okay, people were not drafting Jamar Chase, not drafting Justin Jefferson, knowing they had huge breakout potential because, well, they haven't played an NFL snap. Who cares? Rookies break out every single season. This happens every year. Every year there's a handful of rookies that absolutely go off and explode, and then the next season you typically have to pay a lot more to get them, right? You know, and we've seen it happen at every position. We've seen it happen with Saquon as a rookie. We've seen it with Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, and now Chris Olave at the wide receiver position. This happens in fantasy, guys. And in today's NFL, teams aren't afraid to force feed a player that they just drafted if they have confidence in them. And if they look good enough in training camp, they could end up being the best weapon in the offense. So just because somebody has not played an NFL snap does not mean that you should be afraid to draft them. That's absolutely ridiculous. Right now, most of the rookies you're getting outside of Bijan, you can get at a great value. And if you have a very good reason to believe that they're going to break out in their first year, don't let the fact that, well, they haven't taken an NFL snap yet stop you from drafting them. You're going to miss out on breakout players by doing this. Next on my list is I want to make sure that you guys don't tune out of your draft after round 12. Guys, rounds 12 through 16 are just as important as the early rounds. I mean, you look at some of the breakout players from last year, Tony Pollard, Ramondre Stevenson, Kenneth Walker. I mean, a lot of times you're getting these guys after round 12, and this happens every single year. It's not like last year was an anomaly where a ridiculous amount of breakout players came after round 12 of your fantasy draft. No, this happens every year. It will happen this year and every year going forward. There will be 10 or 15 players, maybe more, that are taken in round 12 or sometimes even going completely undrafted that end up coming off of the waiver wire or, stashed on somebody's bench that they picked up in the later round, and they come in and they absolutely explode, and they provide league-winning upside. Tony Pollard, Ramondre last year, Kenneth Walker. It happens every season, guys. Don't tune out of your draft after round 12. The biggest advantage you can gain in fantasy is not what you do in the early rounds. It's what you do in the later rounds and picking up on those sleepers that could end up being, low-end running back ones, sometimes high-end running back ones like, Jamar Chase in his rookie season. So make sure that you don't tune out of your draft after round 12 because these are really the most important rounds of the draft because you can gain a bigger edge and get those value players. Next on my list, and this is something that really basically has to do with the thumbnail that I made for this channel. You saw Austin Eckler and Joe Mixon in the thumbnail, right? A big problem that I see people making is assuming that what happened last year and the most recent thing that you saw last year is what's going to happen this year. So with Austin Eckler in particular, right, he was the running back 1 last year. He was a running back 2 seasons ago. So a lot of people are drafting him based on this. They've seen what he's done, but they're not putting the pieces together as to what's going to happen this year, okay? Do we have good reason to believe that Austin Eckler is going to actually replicate what he did last season and the season before that? No. And if you ask any fantasy analyst, their only reason for having Austin Eckler where they do is because, well, he was the running back 1 last year. I mean, what are you talking about? He was the running back 1 last year. I have to have him high. I have to have him as my top 1 or 2 or 3 running backs. Last year, he was a running back 1. The year before that, he was a running back 2. Guys, who cares? Situations change in fantasy every single season. And if you look at the way this year projects, with a healthy Justin Herbert who's going to be running the ball more and taking away at least some of Austin Eckler's rushing touchdowns because Justin Herbert wasn't running last year because of the rib injury. With a healthy Keenan Allen, a healthy Mike Williams, and the addition of Quentin Johnston who's balling out in camp, in what universe does Austin Eckler have even remotely the same target share that he had last year? I would love to hear an explanation on this because I know some people are going to come out here and tell me, hey, you're crazy for not having Austin Eckler going in the first round. He was the running back 1 last year. What universe does he see even half the targets that he saw last year? And I'll tell you this, when Keenan Allen came into the lineup last season, in the second half of the season, Austin Eckler's targets were cut nearly in half, just with Keenan Allen coming back into the lineup. He went from averaging almost 9 targets a game to averaging 5.5 targets per game. So look at the difference in overall target share when just Keenan Allen comes back. Now you're going to add in a healthy Mike Williams and the addition of Quentin Johnston, who is not only going to see a pretty good amount of targets, I think, based on what he's doing in camp, but he's going to draw targets within the red zone because of his size. Any guy who's 6'3" plus usually commands awesome red zone opportunity share. We know that Keenan Allen and Mike Williams are going to be targeted heavily in the red zone too. They always are. The reason that Austin Eckler has scored so many touchdowns in previous seasons and had so many receptions is because of injuries to the roster. He will not do this year. This guy is the most obvious first-round bust. And if you draft him, it's just simply not smart. You're basing it on what happened last year, and it just doesn't work that way. And then, I had Joe Mixon in the thumbnail as well. A big reason why I had Joe Mixon in the thumbnail is because people are basing, drafting him in rounds 3 or 4 on, what they've seen him do in the past. They've seen him be a really good fantasy running back before. And back in his day, he was, but this dude is washed up. The yards per carry efficiency last season was terrible, despite the offensive line having a run blocking rating that was top 14 in the league. So the offensive line, especially in the second half of the season, was actually blocking pretty well for him, but he wasn't creating that many yards after contact because he's washed. Joe Mixon's washed up. I hate to tell you, he's one of the biggest early round busts at the running back position. Do not make the mistake of drafting Joe Mixon. Next on my list is this is one of my favorite ones. Look, you've got to understand the differences in ADP across different platforms, right? So, like, if you're doing a bunch of underdog drafts throughout the offseason, sometimes it's kind of hard to adjust to your everyday redraft leagues in your ESPN leagues or Sleeper, Yahoo, whatever you're drafting on. It's really hard to adjust going from drafting hundreds of best ball teams or, even 50 best ball teams and then trying to adjust to a regular draft because the ADPs are just so different. I mean, Calvin Ridley is going around 6 on ESPN. He's going around 3 on Underdog Fantasy, right? Chris Olave is going around 2, sometimes round 3, but usually always round 2 in Underdog. And he's going around 4 on ESPN. So you've got to understand the differences in ADP because there's no reason to snipe Chris Olave in round 2 in your ESPN drafts when you can wait and get him in round 4. So if you don't understand the differences in ADP, the biggest problem you're going to encounter is you're going to be reaching on players when you don't have to and giving up massive amounts of value. So don't do this. You want to gain an edge. You want to wait until you can get a player later, right? So if Calvin Ridley is going around 6 on ESPN, there's no reason to snipe him earlier than round 5 because people aren't going to be savvy enough typically in your everyday redraft leagues to reach for Calvin Ridley. And it's just not something that you want to do because you can get him in round 6. So sniping him in round 5 is okay, but sniping him in round 3 is ridiculous. So you've got to understand the differences in ADP across different drafting platforms. And then here we are at probably my favorite thing that I've been wanting to talk about all offseason, something that just infuriates me when I try to tell people about fantasy football and coach people in fantasy football, and I always get pushback on it. And that is being afraid to draft players if you haven't seen it or if they haven't proved anything. Guys, how are you supposed to get a good player in fantasy that provides you elite upside and gives you a huge positional advantage if you have to see it first to believe it? Fantasy is all about predicting what's going to happen. Once a player has proved it, they then have high draft ADP, right? Tony Pollard and Ramondre Stevenson were massive steals last year, but now you have to pay to get them. And I still think that they're good at their ADP. But typically, when a player breaks out massively, the value that you have to draft them at next year is the value that they're actually providing, so you're not gaining any real edge, right? So being afraid to draft a player because, well, he hasn't proven anything yet. Guys, fantasy is about predicting what's going to happen. That's how you get an edge. So you can't just draft players only if they've already proved it or only if you've already seen it or, this guy hasn't proved anything, so I can't put him ahead of him. Guys, use your instincts, use your knowledge, use the data, use all of the common sense factors. If you think that, for example, say you think that Garrett Wilson is going to outperform Tyreek Hill this season. I'm not saying that I necessarily think that, but just for example, if you think that Garrett Wilson is going to go ahead of Tyreek Hill, or if you think that Garrett Wilson is going to finish ahead of Tyreek Hill, and say you're drafting at the 1.6, and you know that Garrett Wilson is typically going at the 111 or the 112. Now, obviously, he's dealing with the ankle injury right now, so we got to monitor that. But let's say he's 100% to start the season, right? And say that you're drafting at the 1.6, and Tyreek Hill slips to the 1.6, but you know Garrett Wilson is not going to be available by the time your second round pick comes around, and you really think that Garrett Wilson is going to outperform Tyreek Hill, if you honestly think that, and I'm just using this as an example, I'm not saying I necessarily think that's going to happen, but I'm using it as an example. If you really think that Garrett Wilson is going to outperform Tyreek Hill, then draft him ahead of Tyreek Hill. Don't be afraid to draft him just because Tyreek Hill has proven it and Garrett Wilson hasn't. You can't wait until the player breaks out. You have to use your instincts. You have to, be predictive, right? And figure out, what's going to happen. And just because something hasn't been proven or just because something isn't consensus doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, right? Drafting Austin Eckler for last year makes no sense. Draft him for what he's going to do this year. This year he's going to bust, so don't take him in the first round. Garrett Wilson, he was good last year, but he wasn't first round value good. But that doesn't mean that you can't draft him in the first round this year. If you think he's going to provide first round value, just because he hasn't proven to provide first round value yet, doesn't mean that he can't do it. If you really think he's going to do it, then draft him with your first round pick. Be predictive, predict what's going to happen. Don't wait until you've seen it or they have to prove it first or this guy hasn't proven anything. Do not be that guy. Don't be afraid to draft a player that hasn't yet broken out just because you haven't seen it. It can happen. Everybody outperforms their ADP every single season or underperforms their ADP. It happens with all kinds of players. People don't always do what you predict them to do. So if you really think a player is going to outperform somebody that has a consensus higher pick in the draft, then just take them. Take Garrett Wilson over Tyreek Hill if your instincts tell you to. Next on my list is, I'm done with this page. Okay. So next on my list is don't feel like you have to draft an early quarterback, right? So last year, the quarterback position was incredibly polarizing, right? I mean, you had Joe Burrow, you had Josh Allen, and you had Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes, right? And these four quarterbacks finished by far and away ahead of everybody else. If you look at the gap between the number 4 quarterback, Joe Burrow, and then you look at Geno Smith, who was the number 5, there was a massive point gap. So there's now a misconception in fantasy that quarterback is a more polarizing position than running back and wide receiver. A lot of people are going to tell you that because they're basing everything on what they saw last year. And we know that these things don't always repeat themselves. 2 out of the past 5 seasons, quarterback was more polarizing than running back as far as the points between quarterback 1 and quarterback 5. 3 out of the past 5 seasons, there was a bigger difference at the running back position between running back 1 and running back 5, more so than the quarterback position. So these things change every year. And just because something happened last year doesn't mean it's going to happen the same this year. And I'll tell you this, when it comes to the quarterback position, yes, these quarterbacks have higher ceiling, and that is part of the reason why they're more polarizing than they've ever been. But you also have to keep in mind, look at all the quarterbacks that were hurt last year that could have competed for the quarterback 1 spot. Justin Herbert was playing with a rib fracture all season. Dak Prescott missed 5 games. Lamar Jackson missed 5 games. Russell Wilson was on a poorly coached team that massively underperformed. Deshaun Watson was suspended for the entire season. Okay, Tua was dealing with the concussions. I just named 6 quarterbacks that could have competed for the top quarterback spots and at least been close to those other guys that were in the top 4, that would have made the position a lot less polarizing because there would have been a lot more quarterbacks that finished closer together, and it would have been more like the top 7 or 8 quarterbacks that were close in points instead of just the top 4 and then a massive drop-off to the 5th quarterback. A big reason for this is because of all of the quarterbacks that missed time last year. So the quarterback position is not as polarizing as you might think it is. Okay, a lot of this is because of all the injuries and the Deshaun Watson suspension and, Russell Wilson underperforming, all these things that happened last year that were fluky. And now you have all these quarterbacks coming back to a normal situation where they're healthy, their suspensions are out of the way. It might not be a case where there's just 1 or 2 or 3 super polarizing quarterbacks and then everybody else is just a boy among men up there at the top at quarterback. It's just not going to be that way this year. There's a lot more quarterbacks that can compete for the quarterback 1 spot. So you do not have to take Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Pat Mahomes, or Joe Burrow. You don't have to. You can wait on Justin Herbert. You can wait on Deshaun Watson. Okay, Justin Fields in round 5. These are all guys that can compete for the quarterback 1 spot, and you don't have to draft the quarterback early. So I honestly recommend waiting and just drafting one of those guys. Next is don't be afraid to draft players with an injury history. I see this every single season. And what you have to understand is that injury risk is typically baked into value when you're drafting players. So like Breece Hall. Breece Hall would be an easy first-round pick if he wasn't coming off a torn ACL. So the fact that you're getting him in round 3, you're not getting ripped off by drafting a player with a torn ACL. You're getting a player with massive upside, the potential upside to be the best player in fantasy at his position. And the reason he's going in round 3 with that kind of upside is because of the injury. So 1, it's already baked into the price. Okay. Secondly, this is how you get good value on players. A lot of times you get the best value in players, especially in best ball formats where you're just going for a massive ceiling. A lot of times you get the best value on players by drafting players that are coming off, having some injury history. I mean, Michael Thomas is another one. I'm not necessarily saying that I think Michael Thomas will stay on the field. It's very hard to believe that he will stay on the field this season, but I thought that about Christian McCaffrey last year. I thought that Christian McCaffrey just absolutely couldn't stay on the field going into last year, and he was still being taken in the first round. So, why are we afraid to draft Michael Thomas, right? I mean, if you were drafting Christian McCaffrey in the first round last year with his high level of injury risk, how can you be afraid to draft Michael Thomas in round 7? It doesn't make sense. Drafting Christian McCaffrey last year in round 1 was a way bigger risk than this year drafting Michael Thomas in round 7. So to just come out and just automatically avoid every player that's coming off an injury or has multiple years of injury history is usually a pretty big mistake, because we know that injuries can be incredibly random. And sometimes when it seems like a player just absolutely cannot stay on the field, they randomly come out and play an entire 17 games. Look at Dalvin Cook and Christian McCaffrey last season. Michael Thomas could be that guy this year. He could play all 17 games. And then you got a smash player in round 7 because everyone was afraid to draft him because of the injury history. Don't let injury history scare you away. A lot of times it actually increases the value of players because you can get them later because everyone's scared to draft them. And we're drafting for depth anyway, right? You're drafting lots of depth. So if a player busts just because they were injury prone and then they got injured again, it's not going to ruin your roster if you're drafting for depth. So don't be afraid to draft players coming off injury history. Next and final thing here on my list is, and this was one that just cracks me up, when people tell me don't draft a player because their quarterback doesn't support this position. For example, I think somebody commented in my comments the other day when I made my tight end rankings, and I had Darren Waller really high in my tight end rankings. I have him as my number 2 tight end this year, and I know that a lot of people aren't going to agree with that because of recency bias, and he's been hurt 2 seasons in a row. The injury thing that I just talked about, nobody thinks he's going to stay on the field, and everybody thinks he's washed up. Guys, Darren Waller is not washed up, and a lot of what I've heard is people telling me Daniel Jones doesn't support elite tight ends. Who said, right? Daniel Jones has never had a tight end as good as Darren Waller. So a lot of times when it appears like a certain player, a certain quarterback, or even a certain coach, they don't support a certain position. Oh, they don't support running backs. Oh, they don't support slot wide receivers. Oh, they don't support tight ends. A lot of this is because they haven't had a good player at that position, right? I guarantee you Daniel Jones is about to support tight ends when he has Darren freaking Waller to sling the rock to, right? The reason he hasn't supported tight ends like he's going to do in the future is because he hasn't had a tight end like Darren Waller yet. So to sit here and tell me that Daniel Jones doesn't support tight ends is absolute nonsense. He now has Darren Waller. I assure you he's about to support tight ends. All right, guys, make sure to not be a fantasy football chump. Don't make these mistakes. Be a winner. Don't be a loser. All right, guys, appreciate it. Let's go.